Today we're painting Helm Hammerhand, the Wraith of the Hornburg, in this character special painting tutorial. The miniature has been primed with a 𝘊𝘀𝘆𝑔𝐻𝑜st grey surface primer, but any off-white primer will do. I've also added some bird sand to the base. Yes, bird sand, because it's gritty and I like the smell. For the first part of painting this mini, we'll add the base coats. For the tunic, I used an Army Painter Holy White speed paint mixed with a little bit of speed paint medium. I'm not worrying about hitting any other areas like the hair or the surrounding cloth, as we'll tidy that up later on. The trousers were base coated with a deep grey. It's a bit of a tight space, so again, I'm not being overly careful. If it hits the boots, that's fine. We're painting those next anyway. For his boots and the arm guard, I used a Brigadine Brown. It's a nice darkish brown paint and it's pretty useful for most leathery colours. If you do catch the fur near the wrist, don't panic. Just let it dry and repaint a light grey over it, and it'll just reset that area back to grey. The cloth around his midriff was painted with angel green. I remember this look from my early 2000s, when I used to walk around with a hoodie around my waist. The punk rock days. Anywho, whilst applying the angel green, take a bit more care here and try to avoid the white tunic that we've already painted. For the skin, I jumped back over to the speed paint range and used a Crusader skin. I have to admit, this one is quite light and more transparent than the rest of the range. And you'll see a bit more of that whitish colour underneath. So once this first coat had dried, I added a second coat to build up a stronger tone. And if you want to push the shadows further, you could add a strong skin shade, like we've done here. And focus on enhancing his gigantic muscles. Like seriously, the dude's ripped for his age. The paint was also added around his face, especially around the hairline and beard. This will create some nice contrast for when we paint the lighter coloured hair later on. Once this wash has totally dried, and not before if you want to create a big smudgy mess, the hair was picked out with an Army Painter Fanatic Great Hall Grey. This one is a nice off-white tone colour. Think somewhere along the lines between Rakoff Flesh and Pallid Witch Flesh from Games Workshop. Be careful not to paint over those shaded skin areas that we have just painted on. Okay. Now that we have base coats for the majority of the miniature, let's do some quick wins and get a few elements fully painted. I like to do this, especially when it's coming to the end of a painting session, as finishing off a few elements makes the whole model feel less daunting when you come back to it the next time. Have you guys got any tips, tricks or painting hacks that you would like to share in the comments? And maybe there might be some golden nuggets for somebody else out there. So let's help each other out. After the dark tone was added to the boots, arm guard and the trousers, a uniform grey followed by ash grey was added as highlights to the trousers. For the boots and the arm guard, I used a bootstrap brown as a mid-tone highlight, picking out the raised folds and edges of these areas. You'll notice now since our base coats I'm starting to be a little bit neater here. So as you're highlighting, just take your time and enjoy the process. And for those out there that are wondering what brush I'm using, I'm mainly using an Army Painter Wargamer character brush. It's got a good fine tip on it and it's most of the time my workhorse brush. Now for standard troops, this level of highlight would usually be more than enough, and it would look great on the tabletop. But since this is Helm Hammerhand, I want to knuckle down and push it a bit further. So I added a brighter, more focused highlight along the sharper edges. I even introduced a few small scuffy marks and scratches on the boots to suggest a little bit of wear and tear. Because let's be honest, he's not exactly tiptoeing around the battlefield. So I'm just carefully using the very tip of the brush and adding these little scuff marks here and there. Next, I moved on to some smaller areas that are nice to tackle in bite-sized chunks, like the strapping and the belt. Firstly, the strapping on the arms and the boots was base coated with a dusty skull, which will contrast nicely with the darker leather tone that we've got going on underneath. While the belt for the strap and the horn were picked out with an oak brown. Now I've got to take a note from my honesty box here. The first time I saw this model, I wasn't that keen on it. I thought that the pose was alright, but I thoroughly love the old Helm Hammerhand Forge World model. Until I actually got it in my hand and I thought, you know what, this is actually a pretty decent model. Once those little bits like the strapping and the belt and whatnot have been painted, it's time for the washers, which is honestly one of my favourite stages in painting. After taking the time to neatly base coat everything, this is where the model really starts to come to life. I use soft tone over the dusty skull straps, and strong tone over the belt. And whilst we're using washers, I used a green tone over the cloth, letting each one settle into the recesses and naturally create that depth and contrast. Once all three of these areas were completely dry, I highlighted the straps first with a Tomb King tan and, you guessed it, a character brush. Just carefully picking out some of the edges of the strapping, whilst leaving the darker tones that we have just created with the wash well alone. And if you're feeling fine, then you can add a sharper highlight for this area using Ancient Stone to really pick out those edges a bit more. And yes, because he's a character, I did choose the latter and went one highlight further. For the belt and the horn strap, I kept things a bit simpler and a single highlight of leather brown was used. I thought that just one single highlight over this darker brown would be more than enough. You can never have too many brown colours, especially when it comes to fantasy and Lord of the Rings. Everyone's wearing brown. Brown, brown, brown. And a bit of green. You can tell I'm having a bit of fun with this one. So now onto his mighty horn. I started with a dusty skull base coat. Its call was said to echo across the deep, striking fear into his enemies. And considering this sculpt of Helm, he was fighting barehanded and striking down his foes with a single blow. And you can imagine that horn in the dead of winter was probably the last thing you'd ever want to hear. So it's definitely worth a detail giving a bit of extra attention on the model. After the dusty skull base, a few thin lines of mocha skin and bony spikes were used to build up a natural, slightly uneven horn texture. The mocha skin was a slightly thicker line, whilst the bony spikes was more slender. To bring it all together, I applied a mid-brown shade. It's an older paint, so if you don't have it, use something like a soft tone instead. And this was more to just tint the horn itself, so a couple of layers of this was used to soften those transitions. I then went back in with some Banshee Brown and added a few lines going the opposite direction to create a bit more contrast and some darker areas. I also used the same colour to paint on some thin shadow lines between the horn and the metal fittings, just to help visually those two materials read as distinct from each other. And as I graciously mentioned earlier, here is the second layer of the mid-brown wash. And I'm just darkening one part of the horn whilst leaving the area near the mouthpiece a much brighter colour. Once the lighter colours of the horn was complete, it was then time to move on to the metals. I used a greedy gold for the belt fittings as well as the horn filigree. Originally I was thinking of a brassy colour or even tainted gold by Army Painter because that's quite a nice colour, But I thought, no, he's a king, he's a bit more regal than that. Let's just go for a pure gold colour. And my favourite shade paint, probably 9 times out of 10 when I'm painting greedy gold, is Flesh Wash. It's just a nice warm brownishy red tone which goes pretty well with gold colours. I'm just letting it settle into the recesses to bring out the details on the horn, and I added a much larger amount on the opening of the horn itself. Maybe try a couple of layers for this, just to let it build up. For the highlight, however, I did go for a true brass rather than a shining silver. I wanted it to not be so shiny and blingy, but rather more a little bit muted. So true brass it was for the highlight. Next on to the green cloth. I mixed a little bit of webbing green, which is a new army painter from the historical range, with a little bit of war paint stabilizer to thin it down slightly. And then layered this to the raised areas and the folds of the cloth. Mixing the paint with war paint stabilizer is more to improve the flow and consistency of your paints. So when the stabilizer's mixed in, it helps to thin the paint slightly without breaking it down, allowing for a smoother application. And if you add even more war paint stabilizer, then we're in the realms of starting to create a glaze. But today is not that day. I mainly focused on building up the colour gradually, leaving some of the darker tones still visible. Afterwards, I used an olive drab paint to highlight the upper edges and the tops of the folds of the cloth, helping to define the shape a bit more and giving it a cleaner finish. And there's quite a few highlights to do on this bit of the green, so take your time. Slow and steady wins the race. Unless you're getting chased by Helm Hammerhand and his mighty fists. Skin tones now, and I didn't really do too much after our initial speed paint and wash that we used earlier. Here I just used a singular highlight of barbarian flesh, and I focused more on the areas like the cheekbones and the nose for the face, and all of his mighty 𝘉𝘂𝘪𝘯 muscles on his arms and hands. I mean, what kind of gym do they have at 𝘬𝘓𝑚? This guy is huge. I then used a darker colour to deepen down the mouth and the eye sockets, and this was with Brigadine Brown, just to give those areas a bit more definition and contrast before going in with the finer details. And then for that, I switched over to a different army painter brush named the Psycho. And this is the teeniest, tiniest brush that they have in their collection, and it's very, very cute. But it's very good for painting eyes and also teeth, which is exactly what we've done with this miniature. For the eyes, I just did 2 little dots of worn stone either side. And for the mouth, I just prodded that brush in there just to pick out some of the top areas of the teeth for the sculpt. And to add a bit more life to the model, I used tiger eye skin on the lower lip. And added a touch of red tone around the knuckles, because let's be honest, this is Helm Hammerhand, a king who was said to have killed men with a single punch. So having slightly bruised, battered hands and red sores on the knuckles feels just about right for this character. Now we can focus on the tunic. I thinned down some uniform grey paint with medium and carefully applied it into the recessed areas of the tunic. I wanted to push those shadows a little further, as I felt that the Holy White speed paint that we did right at the start didn't quite give enough contrast on its own. Or maybe I'm just being too picky. But this is a character model anyway, so I feel it's worth the extra effort. The same mix was then applied over all of the fur trim around the tunic and near the arm guard. The idea here is to set up a slightly different tone, as we'll be highlighting the fur separately from both the tunic and the hair with a different colour. So visually, all 3 materials will read distinctly when the model is finished. The off-white colour for the tunic, I used company grey here to start with. And the first thing I did was to pick out the top half of the highlight on each of the diamond pattern. Now originally I was just going to leave it there as a singular highlight, but I thought it just needs a tiny little bit extra going on. So I thinned down the company grey paint slightly with some war paint stabiliser and applied it as a soft layer. And I focused my efforts more on the upper half of each diamond to create a subtle, gentle gradient. This is where I really wanted the light to sit, rather than the harsher highlight that we had before. And although it took quite a while to work my way around the whole miniature, about 1 full cup of coffee's worth, it's the main focal point of the model. And, well, of course, his fists. So in my eyes, it's definitely worth the extra effort. To push the separation even further between the tunic and the fur, I thinned down some deep grey paint, and carefully applied this only into the areas where the off-white tunic meets the fur. This will help break up those two materials, and creating a bit more of a deeper shadow. I also used some Banshee Brown in a similar way, between the tunic and the hair this time. It's a subtle step, but it works really well as a kind of visual frame, helping each area stand apart without looking too harsh. For the fur, I kept things fairly controlled and highlighted it using worn stone. And I picked out all these strands individually for this one. I avoided dry brushing here, mainly because I didn't want to catch any of the surrounding areas, and end up doing loads of tidy up work afterwards. It takes a little longer, but the cleaner finish is well worth it. If these were simple, standard foot and rank troops, then I probably would dry brush them all just to get them done that little bit quicker. For the hair, I mixed Gravelord Grey Speed Paint and some Speed Paint Medium together, to thin it down a bit more and create a type of wash. I applied this to the whole area first, letting it naturally settle into the recesses. And then once it was dry, I went back in and added a bit more into the deeper sections, and some of the deeper shadows for the waves at the back. And then finally coming back to our detail brush and highlighting the hair with Great Hall Grey. Picking out the top strands, his eyebrows, and the upper areas of those luscious locks that he's got going on. Helm isn't just another king on the tabletop, this is a figure wrapped in legend. And that's something I always like to keep in mind when painting these character models. You're not just painting a miniature, you're bringing a piece of that story to life. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.